The alarm screamed through Station Epsilon, like a wounded animal, and every being on the trading hub knew that sound meant trouble of the worst kind. In the security command center, Velmer slammed his clawed hand against the console and watched the screens flicker with movement in the lower cargo decks. His reptilian eyes narrowed as he tried to track the creature that had turned his orderly station into chaos. The thing was called a Varish, and the galaxy knew them as Terror-Hounds for good reason. They were apex predators from a dead world that some foolish researchers kept trying to study. This one had escaped 3 hours ago when a transport vessel docked for repairs, and already 7 security officers from 4 different species were in the medical bay with injuries ranging from deep claw marks to shattered bones. Velmer had been station security chief for 20 cycles, and he had never seen anything move like this creature. It was the size of a large earth wolf, but covered in obsidian scales that turned away most stun weapons. Its eyes glowed amber in the darkness of the cargo bay, and its teeth could punch through standard armor plating. The Galactic Council had sent an urgent message forbidding lethal force because the Varash were endangered, but Velmo was running out of options fast. He watched another security team try to corner the beast in Section 7 and watched them scatter when it charged with a sound like metal scraping on metal. The Varash was fast and angry, and nothing they tried was working. Containment fields flickered and died under its claws. Tranquilizer darts bounced off its hide. Even the Krathine warriors who prided themselves on physical prowess kept their distance after seeing what those jaws could do. Then a voice crackled over the comm system asking what was happening, and Velmer recognized the accent as human. Humans were still new to the galactic community, and most species did not know what to make of them yet. They were neither the strongest nor the fastest, nor the smartest, but they had a way of showing up in unexpected places and doing unexpected things. The human identified himself as Jake Martinez and said he worked the night shift in cargo handling. He had heard about the situation and wanted to help. Velmer felt his scales ripple in what his species used to express disbelief. A cargo worker wanted to help subdue a creature that had defeated trained security personnel. Jake arrived at the command center 10 minutes later, and Velmer saw he was completely unremarkable by any standard. Medium height for a human with brown skin and dark hair that stuck up in several directions. He wore the standard orange jumpsuit of station workers and had grease stains on his sleeves. His face was calm, and he carried nothing but a small bag that he said contained his lunch. Velmer explained the situation while Jake watched the monitors showing the Varish pacing in the cargo bay. The creature was snarling at every shadow, and its spine scales were raised like weapons. According to the database, Varash could not be reasoned with or calmed or controlled by anything except pain and fear. They were living weapons that evolution had designed to kill and nothing more. Jake nodded slowly and asked if he could go down there. The question was so absurd that Velmer actually laughed, which came out as a hissing sound. He asked if the human understood what a Varash was, and Jake said yes, but he thought he might be able to help anyway. There was something in his tone that made Velmer pause. The security chief had learned in his long career that sometimes you had to trust your instincts, even when logic said otherwise. He agreed to let Jake try, but only if he stayed behind a barrier field, and only if security teams were ready to pull him out the moment things went wrong. Jake agreed and headed toward the lift that would take him down to the cargo deck. As Jake descended, Velmer pulled up the human file and skimmed through it. Born on Earth in a place called Arizona. Worked various jobs before signing up for off-world duty. No military training and no special certifications. The file mentioned he volunteered at something called an animal shelter back home, but Velmer did not understand what that meant. The cargo bay was a vast space filled with containers stacked 3 high, and the Lighting was dim because of power conservation protocols. Jake stepped off the lift and immediately heard the growling echo off the metal walls. The sound made his heart beat faster, but he forced himself to stay calm and breathe slowly. He could see the Vorish about 50 meters, away near a stack of containers marked with alien symbols he could not read. The creature was magnificent in a terrifying way, with its scales catching what little light there was, and its eyes burning like small suns. It saw him immediately, and the growling grew louder. Jake moved forward, slowly, keeping his hands visible and his posture relaxed. Behind him, he knew Velmer and his team were watching every move and probably thinking he was insane. Maybe he was, but he had seen that look before. That was not the look of a creature that wanted to hunt. That was the look of a creature that was scared out of its mind. The Vorash took 3 steps toward him, and Jake stopped moving. The creature was doing something with its body that the security team probably saw as aggressive display, but Jake read differently. Its tail was low, almost tucked. Its weight kept shifting from side to side, like it could not decide whether to charge or run. Its eyes were wide and kept darting to the exits. Jake had fostered 17 dogs back on Earth over 5 years, and every single one had come from bad situations. He had seen this exact body language in a pit bull named Rocky, who had been used in fighting rings. Everyone said Rocky was vicious. And beyond help, but Jake had spent 3 months teaching that dog it was safe, and eventually Rocky had become the gentlest creature he ever knew. He sat down on the cold metal floor and reached into his bag. The movement made the Vorash tense and bare its teeth, but Jake just pulled out a protein bar and unwrapped it slowly. The crinkling sound echoed in the bay, and the creature tilted its head slightly. Jake broke off a piece and tossed it to the side, not toward the Vorash, but away from it. The creature flinched, and its claws scraped on the floor, but it did not attack. Jake broke off another piece and ate it himself, then tossed another piece to the side. He was showing the creature he was not a threat, and that the food was not a trap. It was a language older than words, and he hoped it translated across. Species. In the command center, Velmer watched in stunned silence as the human sat on the floor, eating a protein bar, while a Vorish circled him like death incarnate. The other security officers were placing bets on how long the human would last. No one gave him more than 5 minutes before the creature attacked, but the minutes passed and the attack never came, and slowly something impossible began to happen in that cargo bay on Station Epsilon. An hour had passed since Jake sat down on the cargo bay floor, and the Vorash had moved closer by maybe 20 meters. To the security team watching, it looked like nothing was happening, but Jake could see everything changing. The creature was still growling, but the sound had lost its sharp edge. Its spine scales had lowered slightly, and its breathing had slowed from the rapid panting of panic to something more controlled. Jake kept his eyes on the middle distance, never looking directly at the Vorash, because direct eye contact meant challenge in almost every predator species he knew. He kept talking in a low, steady voice about nothing important. He told the creature about his apartment back on Earth, and his neighbor who played music too loud, and the coffee shop where he used to get breakfast every morning before his shift. The words meant nothing to the Vorash, but the tone meant everything. It was the same tone he had used with Rocky, and with a German shepherd named Luna, who had been so scared of humans that she would shake and hide. It was the tone that said, "You are safe, and I will not hurt you, and you can take all the time you need." Velmer watched the monitors and tried to understand what he was seeing. His species had tried for generations to communicate with predators from other worlds and failed every time. The idea that a human cargo worker could succeed where trained xenobiologists had failed seemed impossible. Yet the Vorash was clearly reacting to Jake in ways it had not reacted to anyone else. The creature took another step closer and sniffed the air. Jake had tossed as if more pieces of protein bar over the past hour, each one landing a little closer to his position. The Vorash had watched each piece land but had not approached them. Now it moved toward the nearest piece and lowered its head to sniff. Jake stayed perfectly still and kept talking. He was saying something about a hiking trip he took in the mountains when he was younger. The Vorash picked up the protein bar piece in its jaws and bit down. The crunch was loud in the quiet bay. The creature chewed slowly, then looked at Jake with those burning amber eyes. Jake smiled but kept his teeth covered because bared teeth meant aggression. He broke off another piece of the bar, and this time he tossed it only a meter away from himself. The Vorash watched the arc of the throw and then looked back at Jake. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the creature took one careful step forward and then another and another until it was close enough to pick up the food. This time, when it ate, Jake could see the texture of its scales up close. They were not smooth, but had tiny ridges that probably helped deflect attacks. He could see scars to old wounds that had healed badly. This creature had been hurt before, and probably many times. No wonder it was so scared. Jake reached into his bag again, and the Vorash tensed. He moved slowly and pulled out a sandwich he had packed for his break. It was turkey and cheese, and it smelled much stronger than the protein bar. He took a bite himself and then held out a small piece in his open palm. The Vorash could take it or not. The choice was up to the creature. The security officers in the command center were shouting at their monitors, telling Jake to pull his hand back, but their voices could not reach him in the bay. Velmer had his hand hovering over the emergency transport button, ready to beam Jake out the second the Vorash attacked. His heart was beating faster than it should, and he realized he was actually worried about this strange human. The Vorash lowered its head until its snout was centimeters from Jake's palm. He could feel the heat of its breath and smell something like hot metal. The creature tongue flicked out twice, testing the air around the food. Then it gently took the piece from his hand, with a delicacy that seemed impossible for something with such large teeth. Jake felt the roughness of its tongue and the careful way it avoided letting its teeth touch his skin. This was not a mindless killing machine. This was an intelligent creature that understood restraint and choice. He reached out slowly with his other hand, and the Vorash went very still. Jake moved his hand toward the side of its head, where ridge-like structures stuck out near what might have been its ears. His fingers touched the scales, and they were warmer than he expected. The Vorash made a sound low in its throat, and for a second Jake thought he had made a terrible mistake. But the sound was not a growl. It was something else. He began to scratch gently behind the ridge, and the sound grew louder, and he realized the creature was purring or doing whatever the Vorash equivalent was. In the command center, Click Whir, the station biologist had arrived and was staring at the monitors with all 6 of her compound eyes. She was a Threxian, and her species had studied Vorash behavior for decades. What she was seeing contradicted every research paper ever written. Vorash did not show pleasure responses. They did not allow touch from other species. They certainly did not make that rumbling sound that her instruments were picking up. Jake kept scratching, and the Vorash closed its eyes halfway. Its whole body seemed to relax, and the tension that had been coiled in its muscles began to drain away. Jake risked moving his hand to different spots along its head and neck, finding the places that made the rumbling sound grow louder. The creature leaned into his touch like a cat seeking affection. Time passed, and Jake lost track of how long he sat there. His legs were going numb from sitting cross-legged on the floor, but he did not dare move too quickly. The Vorash had laid down about 3 meters away, its head on its front legs, watching him with those amber eyes that no longer looked quite so fierce. Jake started talking again, explaining what he was doing and why he thought it was working. He knew the security team could hear him through the comm system built into the bay. He told them about Earth and how humans had lived alongside wolves for thousands of years. How they had learned to read the body language of creatures that could kill them, because understanding meant survival. He explained that humans had domesticated dozens of species, not through force, but through patience and mutual benefit. Dogs had started as wolves that hung around human camps eating scraps. Over time, the two species had learned to work together to hunt and protect each other. The wolves that were less afraid became dogs, and humans became the only species that could look at a predator and see a potential friend. Velmer listened to Jake talk and felt something shift in his understanding. His species had never domesticated anything. Kratheen were apex predators on their homeworld, and they had climbed to the top of the food chain through strength and cunning. The idea of befriending a predator instead of dominating it or fleeing from it was completely foreign to him. But here was proof that it could work. The Varash that had terrified his entire security force was now resting calmly while a human scratched its head. Jake was not stronger or faster or better armed than the creature. He was simply patient and observant and willing to meet it on its own terms. Jake held out another piece of food, and this time the Varash stood up and walked over to take it directly from his hand. Then it did something that made everyone watching hold their breath. It lowered itself down and rolled partially onto its side, exposing the softer scales of its belly. It was a gesture of complete trust that no Varash in recorded history had ever made to another species. Jake reached out and gently scratched the exposed belly, and the Varash eyes closed fully. The rumbling sound filled the cargo bay like distant thunder, and Jake smiled. He looked up at the nearest security camera and gave a small thumbs-up gesture. In the command center, Velma realized he was going to have to file a report that no one in the Galactic Council would believe without video evidence. 3 days had passed since Jake first sat down with the Varash in the cargo bay, and Station Epsilon had become the center of attention for half the galaxy. The video footage had spread through official channels and unofficial ones, and now scientists from 24 species were requesting permission to dock and observe what everyone was calling the miracle in Cargo Bay 7. Jake had named the Varash Scout because the creature followed him everywhere now, like it was scouting ahead for danger. Scout would trot beside him when he walked to the cafeteria and curl up next to his workstation when he was moving cargo containers. The bond between human and predator had grown so strong that Scout became agitated whenever Jake was out of sight for more than a few minutes. Velmer had cleared an entire section of the cargo deck for their use, and Jake had set up what he called an enrichment area with boxes to climb and ropes to tug and various toys he made from spare parts. Scout loved the rope toys best and would play tug-of-war with Jake for hours, making that rumbling purr sound that the scientists were still trying to understand. Clickwer spent most of her time now studying Scout and taking notes that would probably rewrite xenobiology textbooks. She asked Jake endless questions about his methods and his thinking, and how he knew what to do. Jake tried to explain but found it hard to put into words. It was instinct born from years of working with animals and a lifetime of growing up around creatures that humans had befriended. The other species found it fascinating and frustrating in equal measure. The Kratheen wanted to know if there was a dominance hierarchy they were missing. The Threxian wanted to know if humans had pheromones that affected predator behavior. The Xylothian observers thought maybe humans had telepathic abilities they had not disclosed. Jake told them all it was simpler than that, but he could see they did not really understand. On the 4th day, Scout was sleeping with his head in Jake's lap while Jake ate lunch and read reports on his datapad. The creature breathing was slow and even, and occasionally its legs would twitch like it was dreaming. Jake scratched behind Scout's sensory ridge with one hand, and Scout made a small content sound. That was when the delegation arrived. Velmer came down to the cargo bay with 3 visitors, and Jake could tell immediately that something was wrong. The security chief's scales were darker than usual, which meant he was stressed, and the 3 beings with him had the aggressive posture of people used to getting their way. They were Vorthine, and Jake had seen their species before on the station. They were tall and muscular, with gray skin and too many joints in their arms. They were known as traders and mercenaries, and they had a reputation for being ruthless in business and everything else. The lead Vorthine was named Thrak, and he carried a datapad that he shoved toward Jake without greeting. Thrak said that Scout was their property, and they had the documentation to prove it. The Vorash had been legally purchased from a breeding facility and had escaped during transport. They were here to reclaim their merchandise, and they expected Station Epsilon to cooperate fully with Galactic Commerce. Jake looked at the documents and saw they were legitimate. Scout had a registration number and a purchase record, and everything was filed correctly with the proper authorities. But Jake also saw notations in the margins about training methods and discipline protocols, and his hands started to shake with anger. The Vorthine used shock collars and starvation to control Vorash they captured. They kept them in small cages and only fed them when they showed aggression on command. The creatures were sold to wealthy clients for sport hunting or as exotic guards. The mortality rate was 70% within the first year of captivity, because most Vorash died from stress or injuries sustained during training. Scout had woken up when the Vorthine entered and was now standing between Jake and the visitors. The creature's spine scales were raised, and a low growl was building in its chest. Scout could sense the threat even if the specifics were beyond its understanding. These beings meant danger, and Scout was not going to let them hurt Jake. Thrak said they would be taking the Vorash now and reached into his belt for what looked like a control device. Jake saw red indicators on the device and realized it was meant to activate a shock collar, except Scout was not wearing one anymore. Jake had removed it the first day and thrown it in a recycler. Jake stood up slowly and placed himself between Thrak and Scout. He said very clearly that Scout was not going anywhere. The Vorthine could take their documents and their breeding facility and their entire operation and leave the station. Scout was staying here. Thrak laughed and said humans had no authority to interfere with legal commerce. He moved to step around Jake and reach for Scout. That was a mistake. Jake had been angry before, but always controlled it, always channeled it into something productive. Right now, though, he was not interested in being productive. The punch came fast and hard and caught Thrak right on what Jake hoped was the alien equivalent of a jaw. The Vorthine went down hard, and the other 2 visitors stepped back in shock. Physical violence was rare in galactic society, and most species relied on laws and rules to settle disputes. Humans apparently had not gotten that memo. Jake helped Thrak to his feet and spoke in a voice that was very calm and very cold. He said that on Earth, there was a special place in hell for people who hurt creatures that could not defend themselves. Scout was not property and was not merchandise and was not going back to a life of torture. If the Galactic Council had a problem with that, they could contact Earth Embassy and file a formal complaint. Velmer had been standing back during the confrontation, but now he stepped forward. The security chief translator device crackled as he spoke, and Jake heard him say that station sensors had detected illegal weapons on the Vorthine transport vessel. All 3 visitors were being detained for investigation, and their claim on the Vorash was void. Pending review by station authorities. It was a lie, and everyone in the room knew it, but Velmer was giving Jake and Scout time. The Vorthine protested loudly, but security officers were already arriving to escort them away. Thrak pointed at Jake and said this was not over and that humans would regret interfering. Jake just stared back until the Vorthine looked away first. When they were gone, Jake sat down hard on a cargo container and his hands were shaking again. Scout moved close and pressed against his legs and made a worried chirping sound. Jake scratched the creature head and tried to slow his breathing. He had just started an interstellar incident and probably violated a dozen laws, and he did not care even a little bit. Clickwar approached carefully and asked if Jake was okay. He nodded and said he was fine, but they both knew that was not true. The Threxian said that what Jake did was either very brave or very foolish, and probably both. She said Dvorthine had powerful connections and would not give up easily. Jake said he understood, but he had made a promise to Scout even if the creature did not know it. He had promised to keep Scout safe, and he meant it. If that meant fighting the Dvorthine or the Council or whoever else came along, then that was what he would do. Velma returned after the Dvorthine had been escorted off the station and sat down next to Jake. The security chief was quiet for a long time, just watching Scout play with a rope toy. Finally, he said that his species had a saying about warriors who protected those weaker than themselves. It translated roughly to honored fool, and it was meant as a compliment. Jake smiled and said humans had a similar concept. They called it doing the right thing even when it was hard. Velmer's scales rippled in what might have been amusement, and he said that humans were going to be very interesting additions to Galactic Society. The next morning, Jake received a message from Earth Embassy saying they were sending a legal team to deal with the situation. He also received messages from 3 different xenobiology institutes offering him consulting positions and from a dozen media outlets wanting interviews. Scout received a basket of exotic treats from Clickwar and a new rope toy from one of the Crethine security officers who had been injured in the original incident. Jake sat in the cargo bay with Scout curled up next to him and read through all the messages. The galaxy was watching now, and what happened next would affect more than just him and one Varash. It would affect how humans were seen and how creatures like Scout were treated, and maybe even how different species understood each other. He scratched behind Scout's sensory ridge, and the creature made that rumbling purr. Whatever came next, they would face it together, and that was enough for now. 2 weeks after the confrontation with Dvorthine, the Galactic Council convened a special session to address what they were calling the Varash question. Jake had been summoned to testify, and Earth Embassy had sent their best diplomatic team to support him. The proceedings were being broadcast across Council space, and billions of beings were watching to see what would happen. Jake stood in the center of a circular chamber that was designed to make the speaker feel small and intimidated. Representatives from 40 species sat in tiered seats around him, and their various methods of communication created a constant hum of sound. Scout was not allowed in the chamber, but waited in an adjacent room with Velmer and Clickwar, who had also been called to testify. The council speaker was a being whose species Jake could not pronounce. They looked like a floating crystal that pulsed with light, and their translated voice echoed from speakers built into the walls. The speaker asked Jake to explain his actions and his reasoning for interfering with legal commerce and assaulting a registered trader. Jake took a breath and began to speak. He explained that he was just a cargo worker who saw a scared animal and tried to help. He had not planned to start an incident or challenge any laws. He had simply done what any decent person would do when they saw a creature suffering. One of the council members interrupted. They were Dvorthine, and Jake recognized the aggressive posture. The representative said that humans were new to galactic society and did not understand established traditions. The Vorish were dangerous predators that required strict control. The methods the Dvorthine used were necessary to protect other species and to make the creatures useful. Jake felt his temper rising, but kept his voice level. He said that on Earth humans had learned thousands of years ago that fear and pain were the worst ways to train any creature. Animals trained through punishment became unpredictable and dangerous. Animals trained through patience and positive reinforcement became partners and friends. Another council member spoke up. They were Krathine, and Jake was surprised to see it was someone from Velmar homeworld. The representative asked how humans could presume to understand creatures from other worlds when they had only been exploring space for a few decades. What made human methods superior to techniques developed over centuries by species far older? Jake thought about how to answer that. He said that humans were not claiming superiority. They were offering a different perspective based on unique experiences. Earth had hundreds of species that humans had domesticated or learned to work with. Dogs and cats and horses and birds and even creatures like bees and silkworms. Humans had become experts at cross-species communication not because they were special but because they had to be. He explained that humans evolved as persistence, hunters in a world full of predators. They were not the strongest or fastest, so they learned to think and plan and understand. They learned to read the body language of prey animals to hunt them and the body language of predators to avoid them. Over time, this skill became part of what made humans human. Clickwar was called to testify next, and she presented her research on scout behavior. She showed video footage of the first encounter and detailed analysis of scout stress responses and pleasure responses. She explained that every metric indicated Scout was healthier and calmer now than any Varash ever studied in captivity. The creature showed none of the aggression or anxiety that were considered normal for the species. She said that her conclusions would have been impossible to believe without direct observation. Human methods of animal interaction were fundamentally different from anything other species had tried. The key was empathy and the ability to see the individual personality of a creature rather than just its species. Characteristics. Velmar testified about the security situation and about watching Jake work with Scout. He admitted that he had thought the human would be killed within minutes. He said that what he witnessed changed his understanding of what was possible. The security chief also mentioned that since Jake began working with Scout, there had been no incidents of aggression, and the creature had proven to be intelligent and gentle. The Vorthine representative tried to argue that one example did not prove anything. They brought up centuries of failed attempts by other species to domesticate or control Vorash. They showed records of attacks and fatalities and argued that the creatures were simply too dangerous to be treated as anything other than controlled threats. Jake asked to respond, and the council speaker allowed it. He said that the Vorthine records proved his point rather than theirs. Every failed attempt used force and fear as primary tools. None of them tried patience or understanding or giving the creature a choice. The Vorash were not failures at being domesticated. The other species were failures at understanding how to approach them. He pulled up his own datapad and showed pictures from Earth. Dogs playing with children. Horses working alongside farmers. Cats curled up in sunny windows. Birds perched on human shoulders. He explained that every single one of these species had ancestors that were dangerous to humans. Wolves killed livestock. Wild horses could crush a person with their hooves. Even cats were skilled predators. But humans had looked past the danger and seen the potential. They had offered food and shelter and protection. And in return, these creatures had become partners in building human civilization. Dogs helped humans hunt and guarded their homes. Horses let humans travel vast distances. Cats protected grain stores from rodents. The relationship was mutual and beneficial. Now he had done the same thing with Scout. He had offered safety and kindness and respect. And Scout had responded exactly the way any intelligent social creature would respond. The Varash were not monsters. They were just misunderstood. The council chamber was silent for a long moment. Then a representative from a species Jake did not recognize asked a question. They wanted to know if Jake believed humans could teach these methods to other species. Could the techniques be learned, or were they dependent on some unique human trait? Jake said he thought anyone could learn if they were willing to be patient and humble. The key was to stop thinking about control and start thinking about communication. To stop seeing creatures as things to be used and start seeing them as individuals with their own needs and feelings. He admitted that humans had advantages because of their evolution and their history. But the basic principles were simple. Watch and listen. Respond to body language. Build trust slowly. Never use pain or fear as teaching tools. Reward desired behavior and ignore or redirect unwanted behavior. Treat every creature with respect and dignity. The council speaker asked what Jake wanted the council to do. He could have asked for money or recognition or special status. Instead, he asked for 3 things. First, that Scout be allowed to remain with him permanently with no ownership claims from anyone. Second, that the Galactic Council review and reform laws regarding the treatment of non-sentient creatures, especially endangered species like the Varash. Third, that humans be allowed to establish an interspecies communication program to teach other species these methods. The Vorthene representative objected loudly. They said humans were trying to destroy a legitimate industry and impose their values on the rest of the galaxy. Other species had the right to conduct their business as they saw fit without human interference. Another council member countered that perhaps it was time to re-examine those business practices. The evidence presented showed that current methods were ineffective and cruel. If humans had found a better way, then the council had a responsibility to consider it seriously. The debate continued for hours. Some council members supported Jake and others opposed him. Species that had never interacted much before were suddenly arguing passionately about animal welfare and ethics. Jake stood in the center of it all and felt the weight of what was happening. This was bigger than him and Scout now. This was about how the galaxy would move forward. Finally, the council speaker called for a vote. The proposal was to grant Jake 3 requests on a provisional basis. Scout would remain with Jake. A committee would be formed to review creature welfare laws. Humans would be authorized to establish a pilot program for interspecies communication training. The vote was close, but it passed. Jake felt his knees go weak with relief. The council speaker said that humans had presented compelling arguments and evidence. The galaxy would watch this pilot program carefully and evaluate its success. If human methods proved effective, then perhaps they would be adopted more widely. Jake was dismissed and left the chamber to find Scout waiting outside. The creature bounded over, and Jake dropped to his knees to hug the Varash. Scout made happy chirping sounds and licked Jake's face with that rough tongue. Velmer and Clickwar were smiling or doing whatever their species did to express happiness. The Threxian said that Jake had just changed galactic history. Humans would be remembered for this. Jake just shook his head and scratched behind Scout's sensory ridge. He said all he did was give an animal ear rubs and treat it with kindness. If that changed the galaxy, then the galaxy needed changing. That night, Jake returned to his quarters with Scout and tried to process everything that had happened. Messages were flooding in from across the galaxy. Scientists wanting to study with him. Government officials asking for advice. Animal. 6 months had passed since the council session and station. Epsilon had become the headquarters for what was officially called the Interspecies Communication Initiative, but what everyone just called Jake Program. The cargo bay where Jake first met Scout had been converted into a training facility and observation center. Species from across the galaxy sent representatives to learn, and Jake found himself teaching classes 3 days a week. Scout had become something of a celebrity, which the Varash tolerated with patient dignity. Tourists would stop and stare when Jake walked through the station with Scout trotting beside him. Young aliens would ask to pet the creature and Jake. would show them how to approach slowly with an open palm and let scouts sniff first. The Terror-Hound, who once made trained warriors flee, now let children scratch behind its sensory ridges. The program had grown beyond anything Jake imagined. 23 humans from Earth had joined him as instructors, each bringing their own expertise. There was Maria, who specialized in marine creatures, and Kevin, who had worked with birds of prey, and Lisa, who had rehabilitated traumatized rescue animals for 15 years. Together, they were teaching representatives from 40 different species the basics of empathetic animal interaction. The students struggled at first. The Kratheen had trouble understanding why they should not assert dominance over creatures they were stronger than. The Threxian kept trying to categorize everything into rigid behavioral patterns instead of recognizing individual personalities. The Xylothian wanted mathematical formulas to predict animal responses. Jake spent hours explaining that working with animals was more art than science, but slowly they began to understand. A Kratheen security officer named Verkin had his breakthrough moment when he sat quietly with an aggressive Vorash from a different breeding facility and watched its body language shift from fear to curiosity. The moment the creature approached him voluntarily and allowed touch, Jake saw Verkin's scales shift through colors that indicated profound emotion. The officer said later that he finally understood what humans meant by connection. Clickmore had become Jake co-director, and together they were documenting everything for future research. The Threxian was writing what would become the standard text on interspecies empathy, and Jake was providing practical examples and case studies. They had successfully worked with 12 different species of dangerous predators, and the results were consistent. Patience and respect produced better outcomes than force and fear. The Galactic Council had taken notice. 3 major breeding facilities for exotic creatures had been shut down for welfare violations. New regulations required that all captive predators be given environmental enrichment and positive interaction. The Vorthene had lost most of their market for Terror-Hounds as security animals because trained Vorish, like Scout, proved to be more effective and reliable than controlled ones. Not everyone was happy about the changes. Jake received regular threats from traders and facilities that lost business because of the new laws. Some species still insisted that human methods would not work for their particular situations. There was resistance and pushback, and Jake knew the fight was far from over. But there were victories too. A Kratheen colony world had started a program training local predators to help with search and rescue operations. A Threxian research station successfully domesticated a species previously thought to be impossible to work with. Every week brought new reports of human methods being applied successfully in contexts Jake had never imagined. Earth government was considering the program one of humanity's greatest contributions to galactic society. The ambassador told Jake that humans had found their niche. They were not the strongest warriors or the smartest scientists or the best traders, but they were the bridge between species. They were the ones who could look at the scariest creature in the room and see a friend waiting to be made. Jake was teaching a class when the message came through. Another Varash had been rescued from illegal traders and was being held in quarantine on a nearby station. The creature was aggressive and terrified and had already injured 2 handlers. The local authorities were requesting help from someone trained in Jake methods. Jake looked at his current class of students from 6 different species and made a decision. He said they were going on a field trip. This would be their final exam. They would work together to help this Vorash and show what they had learned. Scout would come too, because having a calm Vorash present often helped agitated ones feel safer. They arrived at the other station 4 hours later and were led to the quarantine section. The Vorash inside the containment field was smaller than Scout, and its scales were dull from malnutrition. It paced constantly and flinched at every sound. The local security chief said they were ready to use sedation if necessary, but wanted to give Jake's team a chance first. Jake had his students observe first and tell him what they saw. Verkin noticed the tucked tail and wide eyes. Lisa pointed out the Vorash kept looking at the exits. Kevin mentioned the defensive posture was not actually aggressive. They were learning to read the signs Jake had taught them. Together, they formulated a plan. They would take shifts sitting near the containment field without trying to interact. They would let the Vorash get used to their presence. They would speak in calm tones and move slowly. Scout would rest where the other Vorash could see and smell another of its kind, behaving calmly. It took 3 days. The students rotated through shifts, and Jake supervised and offered guidance. On the second day, the Vorash ate food that Verkin left near the field. On the third day, it allowed Clickor to approach within 2 meters. By the fourth day, it was accepting touch and making the rumbling, purr sound. Jake watched his students work and felt pride swell in his chest. They were doing this without his direct help. They had internalized the lessons and were applying them with sensitivity and intelligence. When the Vorash finally curled up next to Lisa and fell asleep exhausted but safe, Jake saw tears in her eyes. The local authorities were amazed and asked if someone could stay to continue working with the Vorash. Verkin volunteered immediately. The Krathene said he wanted to take the creature back to his homeworld and start a program there. Jake approved and helped make arrangements. They returned to station. Epsilon and Jake called a meeting of all the program instructors. He told them it was time to expand. They had proven the methods worked. Now they needed to train more instructors and establish programs on multiple worlds. The goal was to make this knowledge widespread and accessible. Maria suggested. They create a database of techniques for different species. Kevin wanted to establish a certification program for qualified instructors. Lisa proposed partnering with animal welfare organizations across the galaxy. The ideas flowed fast, and Jake realized his small program had grown into something much bigger than himself. That evening, Jake sat in the observation area of the training facility, with Scout sprawled across his lap, taking up far too much space as usual. Through the windows, he could see the stars and the ships coming and going from the station. Somewhere out there were thousands of creatures waiting for someone to see them as more than threats or tools. Velmer stopped by and sat down next to them. The security chief had become a good friend over the months and often visited just to talk. He said that the council was preparing a formal recognition ceremony for Jake and the program. There would be awards and speeches, and probably a lot of bureaucratic nonsense. Jake groaned, but Velmer's scales rippled with amusement. The Krathene said that Jake should accept the recognition gracefully because it would help the program credibility. Besides, Jake had earned it. He had changed minds and hearts across the galaxy with nothing but patience and kindness. Scout made a sleepy sound and shifted position. Jake scratched the Vorash favorite spot behind its sensory ridge and thought about how far they had come. 6 months ago, he was just a cargo worker who saw a scared animal. Now he was training instructors from dozens of species and influencing galactic policy. But the core of what he did had not changed. It was still about connection and understanding and seeing past the surface to what was underneath. Whether it was a Vorash or a dog back on Earth, the principle was the same. Every creature deserved respect and compassion. Jake looked down at Scout and smiled. The Terror-Hound eyes were closed, and its breathing was slow and steady. In sleep, the Vorash looked almost gentle, without the intimidating posture and fierce expression. Jake remembered the first time he saw Scout in the cargo bay, all rage and fear and desperation. He thought about all the other scouts out there. The creatures dismissed as dangerous or untrainable or worthless. Each one was an individual with its own personality and needs and capacity for connection. All they needed was someone willing to try. The program would continue to grow and spread. More instructors would be trained, and more creatures would be helped. The galaxy was slowly learning what humans had known for thousands of years: that the bonds between species could be stronger than fear. That trust was more powerful than control. That sometimes the best way to tame a monster was to give it ear rubs and show it kindness. Scout opened one eye and looked up at Jake. The Varash made a questioning chirp, and Jake realized it was dinner time. He stood up carefully, and Scout bounded ahead toward